Hello, you're watching Sky News Breakfast. Our top stories this morning. Further hostages are set to be freed by Hamas today after hours of delay saw the release of 13 more Israelis and 4 foreign nationals from Gaza. That was late last night. Palestinian media has said a further 39 prisoners have been released from Israeli jails and have arrived back in the West Bank. And here in the UK, 18 people are arrested in London during largely peaceful pro-Palestinian marches. Well, in a moment, we'll discuss the papers with author and columnist Matthew Leach and senior reporter at The Eye, Benjamin Butterworth. But first, let's take you through the pages in the newspapers. The Sunday Mirror leads with one father's release following his daughter's release by Hamas, and the headline says his darling girl is broken, but in one piece. Meanwhile, the headline on the front of the Sunday Times reads, they thought they were about to be executed. Then freedom. Now, the front of the Sunday Express says Tory MPs have warned that they face electoral crisis if they fail to stop migrant votes by polling day. And the Sun on Sunday claims the King branded Prince Harry that fool, quoting a new book leaked to newspapers. So those are some of the pages this Sunday. I've got Matthew and Benjamin here to discuss a bit further. We'll start with the Sunday Times, Benjamin, because it would have been a nightmare, immensely worrying that these people thought that they were about to be taken along, killed, but actually it was their moment of freedom.
Yeah, so 13 more hostages, Israeli hostages, have been released from Gaza. And the Sunday Times, their reporter, Christina Lamb, who was in Tel Aviv, tells of how they didn't know what was going on. They didn't know there was a ceasefire. They didn't know they were going to be released. They thought when they were being ushered out, that was to their execution, which gives you a real sense of the confusion and horrors that those hostages have been going through. Thankfully, they were released. It wasn't without delay. There was several hours where Hamas said that not all of the aid trucks had got to northern Gaza that were meant to be. But this is, in what has been 5 or 6 weeks of horrific news, this is some sign of positivity. There was also 39 Palestinians who were in prisons in Israel for allegations of terrorism, among them some children. They have been released and gone back to the Palestinian Authority.
And that's what will trickle down. It's those stories from individual people who have had no idea what's been happening for the last 7 weeks, and then suddenly they're released, Matthew, and it's a story on the front page of The Observer that's kind of honing in on some of those stories.
Well, indeed, it's this sense of the fragility and whether or not there's going to be a lasting arrangement, whether this is going to just be 4 days and then back to fighting in order to deal with the issue. What I'm also getting a real sense of here, though, is this confirmation that the hostages have been held in these tunnels. That's something the Israelis have talked about, although I don't think we actually knew that for certain until this came out. And there's also this reporting I've seen today about how the families get called up the night before to find out whether or not their family member is one who's going to be released the next day or not. And it just leaves me imagining those families of hundreds of Israelis sitting there every night wondering whether they're going to be the chosen ones for the next day. And I think the human element of it that we see in these photos across the front pages is really coming out.
Yeah, there was one case of, we had a report from Israel of Ohad Munda, who came rushing out, and his reaction when he saw his father is something that every parent, every person that can feel humanity in what's happened would have really been torn by that moment.
Yeah, I was watching some of those videos on the car in here, and I almost couldn't watch them because it sort of really humanised what's been going on. It's not just a news story, it's people, like any of the rest of us. But I think the other part of recognising that humanity is to understand that hostage-taking is a strategy that's going on here. We know that Hamas has strong links to Iran, and Iran's stated policy with countries like Britain, let alone Israel, is to take hostages as a negotiation tactic tactic as a way to leverage power. And so although we've got a considerable number of hostages released, I think it would be naive to think that that couldn't go backwards in the coming weeks if tensions flare up, because arguably it's illustrated that it is a very effective way for them to try and wield some power and negotiate their position by taking Israeli hostages and hostages from other countries.
No, it's an interesting point that you make, because those delays, and what you said, Matthew, those delays, any delay, shows how fragile this agreement is.
There's a significant risk here, I think, particularly with the way Hamas plays this, is that they want as much time as possible with this ceasefire in order to re-equip, move around their soldiers, probably move people from north to move them down south to make sure that their fighters are integrated amongst civilians rather than in harm's way. So we're probably going to see even more of this over the coming days, where there's just going to be these constant delays and accusations about the deal and whether or not it's going ahead. It might get extended a few days, it might not. I mean, in truth, it seems to me that the job is not done from the Israeli perspective. After the size and scope of the massacre that happened on October 7th, which we're being reminded of here, just the absolute brutality of that, and the fact that Hamas is still, even if they are diminished, just still a fighting force, means that unfortunately I think this is probably going to go on for some time still.
And the anguish for those families who are still waiting, because we'll have news perhaps later of more hostages released. But on the front page of the Sunday Mirror is the story of Emily Hand, who's marked her birthday while in captivity, being held. And her dad mentioning how, Benjamin, that he at one point came to terms with perhaps that she was dead, and that was a better thought because he didn't want her suffering.
Yeah.
And then the change of emotion that she's there in his arms.
I mean, you just can't imagine it, which is the hard thing about trying to talk about his testimony. But he says she'll have the best Christmas and Hanukkah ever, and you can imagine the relief that they're experiencing now. Emily Hand, I think, is Irish, and the Taoiseach Leo Varadkar tweeted about his gratitude. But there was some criticism of that because he said that she had been lost and now had been found, which raised a bit of discomfort among some Jewish people, some people talking about this topic, because she wasn't lost, she was taken in war as a hostage. And I think language matters when discussing these things, because it's almost dehumanizing to suggest that a person that was taken hostage had simply, as though they'd got lost in a foreign city. That's not what happened. It was a brutal snatching of a 7-year-old child.
And one will have to look to the future at some point to think about the care and the mental health of these children and what investment, because we heard stories of social workers on hand at the hospital and many of the families deciding to stay at the hospital because they felt safer. There'll be a lot of care that needs to be poured into.
But it's just so important we hear these stories, because some of what's happening in recent weeks almost feels like a new Holocaust denial, trying to minimise the atrocities that had happened and the hostage taking and the 1,400 murders in Israel. And I think seeing the testimony of the people, the Israelis, but also the Palestinians who are affected by this is so important, because there are people out there who want to minimise the level of the crimes, the war crimes, the crimes against humanity that have happened in this last 5 or 6 weeks.
Well, it's certainly dominating the papers today. And in the Sunday Telegraph, there is a story about a crackdown on charities that host extremists within their four walls, as it were.
Yeah, this is very much building on what Benjamin has just said here. This is the chairman of the Charity Commission, Orlando Fraser, writing a warning in the pages of the Sunday Telegraph about the Charity Commission's intent to really crack down on organisations that are promoting hate speech, extremism. There's been reports of sermons calling for victory over Jews, over the oppressors, over the destroyed. We've also seen, again, despite this tag of mostly peaceful protests, that there have been many cases of arrests at these protests for some of the signage that people are putting forward. I mean, what really, I suppose, worries me at a deeper level here is you can try to use legislation in the Charity Commission and try to push back against this top-down, but it seems like there's a real kind of rot here that has emerged in terms of this level of hatred that most people thought was something of the last century that didn't exist today in a modern country. And we're seeing today in London, I think, the biggest ever march against anti-Semitism expected
today.
In the streets, something like 50,000 people. And there have been similar marches in places like Paris and across Europe. There was a similar march in Washington, D.C. Just the feeling of a need need to push back against this anti-Semitism that has emerged in the realm of this conflict.
And it's quite, I mean, it's shocking, obviously, but a Jewish friend of mine forwarded me some text messages of how one of his relatives runs a business, and when they the customer found out that she was Jewish, they said they don't want them doing the building work that they were going to do. They removed the work from her.
Extraordinary, isn't it?
And that was in the last couple of weeks, clearly as a consequence of the flare intentions. There was a story in a university where they didn't want to, where a society didn't want to play a sport. I forget which one. I think it was rugby. Yeah, against the Jewish society at the university. And, you know, that does nothing for the people affected by this. And I think whether it's in charities or in universities or in people's private lives and commercial lives, you're seeing that there is an attitude that is clearly racist that in lots of other descriptions we would easily see as unacceptable, but somehow is seeping into normal life.
And that's why conversations like this are so important to have, to keep that narrative going, so people can't bury those types of thoughts. Shall we move on to Lee Anderson, because he's making the front pages again, and Reform too. Talk to me about this story.
Well, there's a suggestion that he was caught saying that he could be paid a lot of money to join Reform UK. Now, for the uninitiated, he is the vice chairman of the Conservative Party, and he is clearly on the sort of Nigel Farage style of politics within the Conservative Party. He represents a seat that's very working class. He's a former trade unionist, and he also is a presenter on GB News, which has a host of those Reform Party people, so clearly he's close to them. And I think there is a sort of a question mark over whether is he playing a game with that. I suspect his seat is not particularly likely to be kept. It's a majority of something between 5,000 and 10,000. It's not, looks like a safe bet. And that's one of the stories that's in the Sunday Times.
Yeah, Richard Tice, obviously, the leader of Reform UK, has denied that Lee Anderson has been offered
it kind of
money in this story.
Speaks.
Shall we move on now to the Sunday Express? Because this Stop the Boats, Matthew, is a big pledge, one of Rishi Sunak's 5 pledges, and it's one of those stories that no party seems to be able to have a firm answer on how to deal with it, not least the Conservative Party. But the Express here, it's their splash on the front page: stop small boats or we're sunk.
Yeah, this is this electoral challenge for the Tories, particularly being talked about on the right of the party, that the Tory party has gone, since 2010, they've said we're going to reduce the number of immigrants. In every single election manifesto, Rishi Sunak made stopping the boats one of his 5 pledges at the start of the year, and there's been this dramatic failure when it comes to being able to deliver what they've promised. And I think it is quite toxic in a way, this kind of over-promising and over-delivering when it comes to migration.
I mean, it's extraordinary, really, that they put the thing that they're failing at the centre of their talking points for the last year. They constantly went on about illegal migration, about stop the boats. And so everyone goes, oh, OK. And then here we are a year later, and they've not stopped the boats. In fact, they're coming in about the same numbers. And legal immigration is at 700,000. Now, for context, when the Tories came to power, they said we'll cut migration to tens of thousands. It was about 250,000 a year when Gordon Brown left office, so it's tripled under the Conservative Party. Now, I would argue immigration is quite a useful thing for the economy, but given they said they'd do one thing and they've tripled it in the other direction, I think the argument that it's going to damage them electorally probably holds a lot of water.
Well, for now, we'll leave it there. Thank you, Benjamin and Matthew. Appreciate your thoughts on those headlines in the papers. We'll talk to you in the next hour.